So with us that we have today, we first have presenting Erica Slaymaker. She is a PhD student in sociology in the Women and Gender with a Women and Gender Studies portfolio program and LGBTQ sexuality studies track. Her presentation is specifically going to be on gender flashpoints at the Texas legislature, longing beyond the gender binary. Thank you, Erica, for being here and can't wait to hear your presentation. And then the second person we have here is, I hope I'm going to say it right, Atalia. Is that how you say it?
Talia, close enough.
Okay, wonderful. She is, I'm sorry, I have my notes right here. She is a PhD student in anthropology in the Women and Gender Studies portfolio program and LGBTQ studies track. Her research that she's going to be talking to you about today is specifically on, longing for affirmation, queer desire, and neoliberal identities. Thank you for being here today. So Erica, if you would like to go first.
Wonderful, thanks so much. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, when I do that, can you see the full screen or is there like a black box or anything? Okay, great, thanks y'all. Okay. I'm not great at technology. All right. Okay. So hi, everyone. So wonderful to be here today. I said this earlier, but just thanks again to everyone who has helped make this conference possible. Today, I'm going to share a little bit about my dissertation research so far. So the gender binary has been incredibly resilient, even though social scientists and LGBTQ social movements have shown that many people across time and space have lived and identified outside of the boundaries of binary gender. Feminist scholars like Gail Rubin and Chandra Mohanty and many others have theorized for decades that the gender binary is a tool that maintains patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism. Even natural scientists have revealed that the gender binary does not accurately reflect the spectrum of physical and biological expression of sex and gender. And yet, here we are. Societal and cultural investments in the gender binary remain strong. The gender binary is routinely institutionalized in spaces that are segregated by gender, such as bathrooms, locker rooms, schools, and sports teams. This year, fights over the meaning of gender have been playing out in state legislatures across the country. So my research is guided by larger questions of why does the gender binary have such a hold on society? How do we dismantle it? And to begin to chip away at these questions, my research investigates the social forces that promote binary thinking about gender through an analysis of what I call gender flashpoints. Gender flashpoints are public controversies in which questions of gender identity, inclusion, and belonging are debated publicly and receive a surge of attention from media, politicians, and activists. People ask who counts as a man or a woman, who belongs where, how does someone know their gender, what is the relationship between gender and embodiment? And people are literally asking these questions right now. Like yesterday, Ted Cruz asked the Supreme Court Justice nominee to define what a woman is. There have been many think pieces and media stories discussing Leah Thomas's participation in women's swimming. And in these moments of conflicts, some social groups organize to reinforce the binary, while others, often transgender, intersex, and gender nonconforming people, promote the view that gender is more expansive. And these gender flashpoints often include concerns about embodiment and access to gender segregated spaces, such as sports teams and bathrooms. Sociologist Miriam Abelson calls gender segregated spaces, quote, amplified sites of gender and sexuality. And these spaces serve as central arenas for conflicts about what gender means and how it should be understood. So to understand the varied interests that contest and those that bolster the gender binary, I have focused my research on a case study of the 2021 anti-trans sports bills at the Texas legislature. Oops. The Texas legislature has been a battleground over transgender, intersex, and non-binary young people's access to sports, healthcare, and parental support. Equality Texas, one of the leading statewide LGBTQ organizations, counted 76 anti-LGBTQ bills filed in Texas in 2021, with a majority specifically relating to transgender people. And out of all these bills, Republican efforts focused on restricting transgender and non-binary young people's access to athletics in K-12 public schools. LGBTQ activists resisted, but Republican legislators prevailed in passing legislation that further enshrined the gender binary into law in Texas. And Texas is one of 11 states that has enacted similar laws across the country. But rather than an outlier, the case of Texas is essential for understanding a larger recent wave of anti-transgender legislation. To investigate this case of anti-trans legislation and learn how activists have responded to it, I was a participant observer in LGBTQ activist efforts at the Texas Capitol during the legislative session from January to October 2021. I attended rallies, lobbying trainings, office visits with legislators, committee hearings, strategy sessions, vigils, and webinars over 10 months. Additionally, I've conducted 8 semi-structured interviews with activists about their experiences and their approaches to strategy during the legislative session. And I find that LGBTQ activists and their allies utilize several strategies, including mobilization, lobbying, and testimony to achieve their goals and to protect the rights of transgender kids. Activists mobilize to rallies and vigils with the goal of recruiting a coalition of LGBTQ adults, children, and allies to go to the Texas Capitol and make their presence known through chanting, sign holding, and simply taking up physical space. They lobbied, directly engaging with legislators and staff members. Volunteers would lobby by visiting legislative offices in person, making phone calls and emailing legislators. A few staff members at LGBTQ organizations were specifically hired as lobbyists and were expected to build deeper relationships with legislators and gather insider information about bill movements and legislators' plans. And finally, advocates testified. They told personal stories and made speeches at legislative committee hearings, which often lasted until the early hours of the morning. They spoke about their experiences and their emotions at press conferences and rallies and other events. And in each of these activities, activists have struggled to articulate a clear response to efforts to keep trans young people from participating in sports. They've disagreed with each other on strategy, on who the main audiences are, and what the main frame should be to keep legislators from advancing harmful bills. And one of my preliminary findings is that within these tactics, LGBTQ activists both challenge binary discourses as they simultaneously draw upon binary discourses to make their case against anti-transgender legislation. Even as activists work tirelessly to expand options for transgender young people and to challenge binary thinking about gender, they also reproduced it, particularly in their descriptions of vulnerability, victimhood, and safety. They often refer to transgender young people's vulnerability to violence, particularly young women's vulnerability to violence. And both sides of the debate mirrored each other in their focus on young girls' safety, often young white girls' safety. These conceptions of vulnerability reflect racialized and binary conceptions of gender. And in their messaging, supporters of anti-trans legislation claimed that they were trying to save women's supports and protect women and girls. In response, LGBTQ activists emphasized inclusion and the right to participate in school activities, in addition to bringing attention to the cruelty of the legislation and the impact on young people's mental health. When questions arose about how to address questions of embodiment and competitiveness in athletics, activists struggle to articulate a clear answer or sometimes avoided answering. And so some of these difficulties might point to how and why the gender binary is so resilient. Anti-transgender sports legislation is aimed at maintaining and reifying a binary institution. School sports are almost always gender segregated spaces. And so as such, trans activists find themselves in a difficult position of fighting for access to and inclusion in a binary institution. And as I said, these findings are very preliminary. This case elucidates both the possibilities for and challenges to dismantling the gender binary through political action, shedding light on the difficulties that LGBTQ movements face and some of the ways that they are responding to the current political moment. So by grappling with the complexities of organizing against this type of legislation, I hope to shed new light on debates about the resiliency of the gender binary. And so then also just to take a moment, before I finish, I want to take a few moments to talk about some of the most recent anti-trans actions by state leadership in Texas. I had planned to finish data collection by now. I was hoping to have finished it. But in the last month, another gender flashpoint has emerged in Texas. On February 22nd, Attorney General Ken Paxton issued a non-binding legal opinion that trans affirmative medical care for young people should legally be understood as child abuse. And in response to this opinion, Governor Abbott ordered the Department of Family and Protective Services to investigate families and institutions that provide transgender children with affirmative medical care. And so this is an escalation of the anti-trans attacks that were waged in Texas in 2021. While legislators last year discussed expanding the legal definition of child abuse to include supporting transgender children's access to medical care last year, this was seen as too extreme by many Texas elected officials. And so I'm worried about this. I think this shows a worrying trend in anti-trans attacks in the state and in the country. Right-wing political actors are seizing opportunities to enact policies that are more extreme and more cruel than even last year. And in response, once again, LGBTQ activists have mobilized large rallies, lobbied state officials, and testified at hearings. And to give you a sense of this, on March 11th, more than 80 advocates testified at the Department of Family and Protective Services Council meeting. Parents, trans adults, and young people and other advocates spoke out against DFPS child abuse investigations of families with transgender or non-binary children. Parents and children are concerned about the consequences of speaking publicly. So to protect the identities of families, advocates read anonymous testimonies on behalf of those who were not comfortable speaking at the public meeting. And it was an incredibly moving testimony. Again and again, advocates repeated the same line, that they were speaking on behalf of, quote, parents of transgender children, many of whom are terrified to be here today. And this organizing is happening at the same time as Lambda Legal and the ACLU of Texas, among other organizations, are bringing legal cases against the state of Texas. And there's currently a temporary injunction on Governor Abbott's order. So that means that the courts have prohibited Texas from pursuing these investigations of families for the time being. And this decision is in the process of being appealed by the Attorney General. So right now, advocates are focusing on providing legal resources and support to trans young people and their families. So I just want to take a moment to share that information and make sure folks know about those recent actions. And there's a website here that has a number of resources for trans young people and their loved ones, and also an action link for folks that are interested. And so this most recent case illustrates again the active and ongoing nature of gender flashpoints in Texas right now. Political actors continue to both contest and reinforce the gender binary. And my research will continue to investigate these flashpoints to not only understand the of the binary, but also strategies for dismantling it. So thank you both so much.
Thank you so much, Erica. If you have any questions for Erica, please drop them in the chat and we will address them at the end. Next, we have Atalia.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm glad to be in the panel with you, Erica, and I look forward to how our talks maybe connect, I'm not sure. Yeah, so let me share my screen. Do you all see the presentation or the entire screen?
It's the present. I see the presentation.
No, you see the present. Okay, yeah, the presentation, great. Okay, so just a sec. Okay. Yeah. In a 2019 New York Times article titled "Living as Myself at Last," Alexandria Holder, a technical sergeant in the United States Air Force, recounts her hard days as a closeted trans woman in the military during the Trump years. When she finally comes out, an old supervisor who once made comments about trans people being unfit to serve in the Army actually supported her decision. She ends her piece on a positive note. A wave of thoughts and emotions washed over me, mostly relief and, strangely enough, gratitude. I had gone through so much and worked so diligently to try to prove to my old supervisor, myself, the Air Force, and those around me that I was a human being worthy of respect and worthy of the uniform that I still wear. With a simple act, my former supervisor provided me with that validation. In that moment, it felt like my transition was finally complete. The past decade has witnessed major changes in queer politics and discourses. The US Supreme Court jurisdiction regarding same-sex marriage, the proliferation of LGBTQ+ representation in the media, the rise of transgender public visibility in what cultural analysts dubbed the transgender tipping point, the embrace of identity politics jargon into the liberal mainstream. All of these phenomena and more have had significant impact on how queer people and movements speak, identify, perform, and practice their queer ideals. In this paper, I would like to argue that this impact marks a shift in how queer desire is manifested and positioned in contemporary social life and politics. This is a shift towards what I call a queer desire for affirmation. Holder's article is just one example of many queer and trans people who publicly talk about their need for validation, to affirm both to others and to themselves who they are. A myriad of trans celebrities, from actors and TV personalities to models, singers, and tech people, tell the press when they come out about how they are finally who they are and ask the public, at times directly and at times elusively, for recognition. This sort of affirmation goes back in queer and especially trans history. Writing about transsexual autobiographies in the second half of the 20th century, trans literary scholar Jay Prosser analyzes how the need of the physician's permission to undergo sex reassignments demanded the creation of a trans clinical genre, where trans authors affirmed their own identity by allying with specific narrational elements. At the same time, queer and trans politics are embedded in histories of radical resistance, defying identity as a cultural form and using perverted bodies to revolt. Trans activist Sandy Stone said at the end of the 80s that trans people should turn post-transsexual. They should stop putting into question gender as a system. Groups like STAR, Street Transvestites, Action Revolutionaries, and Queer Nation kicked respectability politics out the window while visibly occupying public space. Contemporary desire for affirmation, in a way, is in direct contrast to that. Today, queer politics are about, in a way, organizational workshops about diversity, inclusion and safety. Cisgender professors and university employees are encouraged to add their pronouns to their email signatures, promoting a friendly and inviting campus climate for trans and queer students. Film and TV series exhibit trans and even non-binary supporting characters played for a change by trans and non-binary actors. While this is commendable and important, I would like to explore what this queer politics omits in its desire for affirmation. In her discussion of affective happiness, cultural theorist Sarah Ahmed writes that to think about happiness is to think about the role of affirmation. To affirm can mean to state or assert positively, as well as to establish, confirm, or ratify. To be affirmed is to be given positive encouragement, which might be what confirms a certain order of things, or create order out of things, or put some things and not others within reach. While from a liberal point of view, this framing of affirmation is necessary and therefore encouraged, Ahmed stresses that this depends on what our orientation is directed at. Happiness projects, like the nuclear family, for example, would use repetitive affirmation in order to assert themselves as a positive and right way of being, sustained by a desire to keep on the right path, as Ahmed would put it. What is this right path in the context of contemporary queer and trans politics? And what gets kicked to the side of the road because it is not going in the right direction? I want to argue that this queer longing for affirmation feeds into an ongoing process of a neoliberalization of queer identities, practices, and performances. This neoliberalization is manifested in three interrelated cultural projects: normativity, co-optation, and alienation. Affirmation is essentially a normalizing project. It demands the recognition of the heteronormative hegemony, recognizing it in return as a legitimate public sphere, as Habermas would think of it, a critical sphere of public debate in which all of the participants have access to it. This normativity constructs an understanding of queer and trans subjectivities as an integral part of liberal politics, dichotomizing heterosexual, conservative, and progressive politics, while rendering invisible issues of critical sexual and gender politics that scrutinize heteropatriarchy and other marginalized systems. Co-optation is the second neoliberal practice that sticks to queerness, continuing and proliferating the normative project. Queer affirmation desires to be a part of various cultural hegemonic institutions: the military, the government, Silicon Valley, the marriage institution. The neoliberal state in its turn uses this desire to mark co-optation as the only way to progress, equality, and liberation. For what is more liberating than being the first polysexual CEO, the first trans model at a famous fashion company, or the first queer military general? This leads us to the third neoliberal practice: alienation. This is a loaded term that goes back to Marx and his critique of capitalist estrangement, where he says that the product of the workers' labor is taken from them and becomes hostile. In a way, neoliberalism alienates queers from their anti-normative politics, if we might think of the latter, as the product of our labor as queer people. Desiring normativity and being co-opted into the hetero-liberal order, queer and trans subjects are encouraged to forget their own dialectic histories in what cultural theorist Lisa Lowe would call in her writing of Intimacy and Colonialism a teleology of progress. LGBTQ plus oppression is rendered to belong to the past, erasing its legacies, aftermaths, and hauntings in the present. This liberal forgetting also alienates queers from histories of resistance, both of queer movements, but also moments, practices, and forces of solidarity between queer bodies and other disposable beings. Indeed, one has to develop a certain kind of queer alienation in order to be oneself in the United States Army. This neoliberalization of queer identities and practices has very material, symbolic, and political implications that has been addressed in queer studies in the past decade and more. Jasbir Puar talks about the ways in which gay identity, and now we might add also trans identities, has been co-opted into the state, rendering brown and black bodies and people killable and exploitable through practices of pinkwashing. Jack Halberstam discusses the proliferation of the triggers discourse, reducing much needed trauma and healing discussions into a shallow talk of do no harm without addressing other modes of oppression and violence toward both queer and other subaltern groups. Jean Harita Warren argues how queerness is being regenerated as an artifact that demands protection, producing the cultural form of the homophobic migrant who should be hated and disposed of. While this is unsettling, I am not suggesting here a nostalgic take on lost queer politics. After all, queerness's strength has always been its ability to adapt, to revolt, to puzzle, to disperse and resurface. Rather, I am concerned of the orientations of this queer desire for affirmation, directionalities that are aligned suspiciously convenient for the state and industry. Thus, using again Sarah Ahmed's concept of queer phenomenology, I would suggest a redirection of this desire to locations of attachment and alterity. In this, I am inspired by scholars like the indigenous feminist Kim Tolbert, which also just mentioned in their talk in the last panel, who suggests to think of critical polyamory as a decolonizing practice of settler intimacy, or anthropologist Radhika Govindrajan, who thinks through queerness about women's desire desires and interspecies alternative relations. Or trans scholar Eric A. Stanley, who calls to step beyond liberal politics into an abolitionist way of life, which will turn queer and other bodies ungovernable. While desire might seem like it works in mysterious ways, queer ancestors and descendants teach us that it is actually profoundly political, paving the way for our bodies to direct their desires to other diffused bodies and populations. Attaching itself to locations of radical alterity, this desire has the potential to ignite other forms of attachments and unruly longings, bringing forth a new political disruptive horizon of the present. Thank you.
Thank you. You both have wonderful presentations. I'm sure so many people have questions. If people could drop them in the chat or honestly just ask them directly, whichever you want to do.
I have a question. Oh, Michal, you have your hand raised. You can go first if you'd like. Mine's kind of a very loose idea.
No, go ahead. You go first.
Okay. I was kind of just wondering, I think you both kind of super briefly touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering where each of you see your projects kind of going in the future, / what are some things that you're still thinking through? I think a lot of times these questions have like big ideas about what you've already said, but I'm really interested in like where else are your curiosities like lying that you're like thinking through still?
Erica, do you want to go first?
You can go ahead.
No, I still need to think about my answer.
Okay. I feel like I'm still, and maybe this, well, I'm trying to think through what are ways of resisting some of these recent anti-trans attacks that open up more possibility. Right now, the conditions of possibility within these attacks, it feels so stilted, especially here in Texas, but I think in other places too. And so what are strategies? What are ways of resisting and challenging specific legislation, policies that open up more possibility for queer and trans people, especially queer and trans young people in this moment who are at the center of these attacks, but also just queer and trans people more broadly, of like, how can we have a more expansive response that opens up possibility and life chances for folks? So I don't have good answers for that yet. So that feels like one place that I'm continuing to puzzle.
Yeah, in a sense, along the same lines. I'm only first year, so I have still time for my project to develop. But I think that what I'm trying to think about is how to move queerness away from the kind of things that, at least politically, it's engaged with now, and how to actually rethink about our attachments, both within, I guess, the LGBTQ plus community, and also beyond, and how to think about, basically our attachments and connections to other bodies or other groups. And I think that's where there still is a lot of potential. So that's what I keep on getting back to.
All right. Mikkel, did you still have your question?
Sure. I actually have a question to a different question for each of you, but I'll start with Atalia. I was wondering how you see the role of the academy within this neoliberalization of sort of queer politics, and how you see yourself within the academy trying to sort of, whatever, destabilize, or however you want to, think about what you're trying to do within the sort of conscript of the academy. Yeah, so I'll start with that.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah, I'm not sure I have a very efficient or detailed answer, but I think that I would say that I see my position within the academy is to talk about queerness beyond inclusion, because ever since I'm new to the US. I came in August, and the discourse about queer issues, and specifically trans issues, in at least the academic circles I'm in here, are much more developed, I guess, than things that I know from Israel Palestine. But at the same time, I feel like we can go much more beyond that, and towards other other modes of thinking, and generally I really like the idea that queerness is a way of thinking, that we can use queerness, which is something very basic, I guess, to say, but we can use queerness as an actual framework of thinking, rather than a mode to talk about our own identities. Or if we talk about our own identities, then how do we disrupt certain connections that have become very much common knowledge, or very much, embedded within certain kind of progressive thinking, which was after a lot of years of struggle, but still, I think again, all of this omits something else. Yeah.
Thank you. That was super interesting. I have a question for Erica too, but I think maybe if other people have questions, maybe I should give space for other people.
Erica, you have a question in the chat.
Great. Talia asks, Erica, do you think the idea of the children as needing protection plays a part in the strategy to enforce gender binary? And yes, I do. There's something going on with children so often at the center of these gender flashpoints, and it feels like there's anxieties about the nation, about family, about nuclear family, and then within that, like race and also class and economic anxieties that are all strategic in trying to uphold and enforce gender binary that's interconnected with all of those other institutions and systems. But that's something I'm still trying to more specifically detangle in my work. And it's a great question. So thank you for asking that, Tali.
Yeah, that was a great question, especially because I think it's definitely a blanket over an issue. It actually relates with my research. I always go into what people think parents are saying, oh, we're protecting the children. They're not protecting the children. For your question, Tally, if you look at family values in terms of the 1980s and the whole Tipper Gore, Ronald Reagan thing, that's kind of how you start getting to what we're talking about now, about gender binary and how we're trying to regulate schools and all the information that we're doing now. It's been going on now for 40 years. I don't know how it's going to shape in the future, but it definitely shows you how relevant these topics are now and how they were relevant even back then in other forms.